Bueno, buenas noches. Muchas gracias, en primer lugar, a Michael Ignatieff por acompañarnos en Madrid. Muchísimas gracias también a todos los asistentes por compartir esta noche de verano y también a los directores del festival, Marcela Vélez y Javier Moscoso, por invitarme a participar en esta segunda edición del Festival de las Ideas. Estamos aquí en una de las plazas del centro de la ciudad para hablar ni más ni menos que de virtud y de compasión. ¿Quién no querría ser tenida por su entorno, ¿no?, como una persona compasiva o virtuosa? Y sin embargo, como sucede en muchas ocasiones con los términos de la filosofía, ¿qué es la virtud? ¿Sabríamos decirlo? Así que quizá podemos empezar por ahí. Profesor Ignatieff, cuéntenos, para quienes no hayan leído Las virtudes cotidianas, su último libro, ¿qué entiende usted por virtud y qué son las virtudes cotidianas?
Well, first of all, I'm sorry I look like an airline pilot. It's because I don't speak your beautiful language. It's a fantastic evening. I can't see you, but I believe you're out there. They tell me there's an audience, and it's very good that you can be here, and I hope that you can understand me. I see many blue lights, which indicate that my words are being translated, so I hope we can have a good conversation. Virtue. Let me make a confession. I'm a historian, not a philosopher. Carmen is the philosopher, but she's asked me about virtue. I think virtue is, when we think of the great virtues, the heroic virtues, courage, patience, humility. We're talking about dispositions of character that have a moral content and become good to the degree that they help another person. So they are dispositions, meaning there are things we do. We don't reason about courage. We're either courageous or we're not. And our courage becomes a virtue when we grab a child and prevent it from falling. We defy a tyrant who's oppressing people. So it's a disposition. It can become a habit. It is when we take a moral principle and we put it into action as a form of life, which becomes constitutive of who we are. Is that too many words? It's my best effort. There we go.
Es perfecto para empezar. Y a partir de ahí, una de las cosas que más puede llamar la atención, ¿no?, de este libro es cuando relata los encuentros que tuvieron en distintísimas partes del mundo, un viaje por 4 continentes, en países como Estados Unidos, Sudáfrica, Bosnia, Brasil o Myanmar. Y en todos estos lugares habla, ¿no?, y relata este encontronazo con unas virtudes cotidianas muy parecidas en un lugar y en otro, aunque se expresaran de manera diferente. ¿Cree que esa especie de terreno moral compartido ha existido siempre? ¿O cree más bien que ese orden moral, en algún sentido compartido, surge en el siglo XX, sobre todo a partir de la revolución de los derechos humanos, de la que también ha hablado?
Let me give you a sense of what this book. The book is called Ordinary Virtues, and it's a book of journeys. It's a travel book. It's a travel book that took me to the favelas of Rio de Janeiro. It took me to the shanty towns of Pretoria, South Africa. Places which are conventionally described as places of disorder and chaos. In fact, if you go to a favela in Rio, what you see very quickly is a very intricate order. You see neatness, you see tiny little spaces being kept miraculously clean. You see children doing their homework on computers. You see a whole set of eyes looking out for trouble and keeping order. And I'm not saying this is the situation in all favelas. In some favelas, they are dominated by drug lords and criminals, and there's violence, but the favelas that I was shown were a kind of picture of moral order. And I was just interested how moral order reproduces itself in conditions of extremity. It's a very touching thing to go to a shanty town outside Pretoria, the capital of South Africa, where there's no running water, there's no electricity, there's nothing. And South Africa in the winter is bitterly cold. People living in essentially cardboard shacks, raising children in cardboard shacks, and somehow managing to create a minimum of defensible space and order. And it seemed to me that's what I was trying to capture by the idea of ordinary virtues. I don't want to be sentimental about very poor people. I don't want to ignore the violence. I don't want to ignore the suspicion. I don't want to ignore the hatred. But I do want to put emphasis on their capacity to create order, to make their lives bearable. And that requires a constant display of virtue, and the key virtue is microscopic trust between your neighbor who shares the same piece of cardboard, and you sleep on one side and he sleeps on the other. And somehow he doesn't steal your possessions most of the time. And these microscopic forms of trust are a tremendous human achievement because they save people from total despair. These are people often in the favelas, but also in the shantytowns of South Africa, who have been shamefully neglected by their country. And so they have to do it themselves. And I'm looking at how they tried to do it themselves, and it took me to Myanmar, it took me to South Africa, it took me to the United States, to poor communities in Los Angeles. And I'm interested how social life is reproduced as a moral practice. I'll stop talking, but a final example. I didn't meet Carmen until this afternoon. I've never met Carmen before. I've never, unfortunately, read any of her work. But I trusted her to have a conversation with me in which you wouldn't nail me to the wall. You wouldn't mess with me. I don't quite know how we established that trust. Partly it's because the Festival of Ideas wouldn't put it together if you weren't a reliable person. I'm trying to illustrate that, in fact, a moral transaction involving virtue has been involved with us. And I hope we become friends. But we're doing this all the time. We're turning strangers into partners. We're turning adversaries into partners. We're turning adversity into the bearable. And it's a moral practice of establishing forms of trust between strangers. And I've been thinking about this for 40 years. My first book was called The Needs of Strangers, and I'm still at it. Sorry to go on so long.
No. Al revés, tenemos del tiempo para esto, ¿no? Y precisamente como es un trabajo de toda una vida, me quería preguntar también por los opuestos, ¿no? Por los que quizá en el libro aparecen al final y ahora igualmente, ¿no? Mencionaba brevemente qué hay de los vicios cotidianos, ¿no? Podríamos preguntar. La envidia, la avaricia, el odio, la corrupción, la intolerancia, porque sin duda forman también parte del día a día de cualquier comunidad humana y me interesa también que comparta algo sobre esta visión. ¿Qué relación tienen? ¿Cree que están igual de presentes? ¿Cree que también cuál es el papel de las instituciones para potenciar o impulsar las virtudes o más bien los vicios, ¿no? Yo creo que por ahí también sería interesante, si puede decir algo.
Yes. I think these journeys that I took to sometimes dangerous, sometimes scary places in 2014, 2015, was an attempt on my part to get away from my middle-class safety zone. My virtues I learned in a middle-class home with loving parents in a country called Canada, which has rule of law, has police protection, which creates expectations of the state that the state is formally required to fulfill. I went to a school, it was orderly, etc. And this is the moral frame, I hope, for many of the people in this audience. But it's not the moral frame for about 2 billion people in the world. To a degree that I hadn't appreciated, even in a place like South Africa, which we greeted as a new experiment in democracy under Mandela, the degree to which the people I talk to have been totally abandoned by their state, by the police, by all the institutions, was terrifying to me. I was frightened to be with them. I thought, how am I going to be safe, let alone how are they going to be safe? So I was tremendously interested in how they reproduce moral order in conditions of total abandonment. And so that's, and much of what you see is also very corrupt, is vice. We have to understand, for example, drugs, drug lords, drug gangs, as institutions that also provide order. They enforce order. They enforce order by degrading the public, by intoxicating the young, by enslaving them, by ruining their lives, by terrorizing their families, but it is a coercive order of a kind. And I don't think you can understand why it's so difficult to crush drug gangs unless you understand the social service they provide. Because everybody's primary problem is order. Who will protect me? And a lot of the corruption, a lot of the vice that creeps into these communities and every other community occurs because people with guns and drugs come in and say, I will protect you. I will protect you for a price. And the price is your children, right? And this is horrifying and terrible, but we need to understand that it's not just wickedness or evil we're dealing with. We're dealing with a competition in who gets to establish order. And the state, the police, has to break the power of these people in order to establish an order that escapes people from corruption, crime. And so I was doing a kind of moral sociology of order. And one of the things, you asked me this question a few minutes ago, and I wanted to answer it. Because I teach human rights for a living, I was kind of wandering around the world trying to figure out, once you got outside the UN, once you got outside the state, once you got outside the classroom, whether anybody the hell believed in human rights at all. Did anybody believe in human rights in a favela? Did anybody believe human rights in a shanty town? The shorter answer is no. The longer answer is they think they are not garbage. They think they are not to be pushed around forever. They think they are agents. They think they have a dignity. These are very important things, and they are virtues, a sense of pride in yourself. Why do you sweep the floor of your miserable hut unless you believe it should be clean and your child should be as clean as you can make it? That's a demonstration against all odds of your dignity as a mother and as an agent. and your passionate desire to give your child something better than the dirt that is literally the other side of the wall. And I think we have to pay homage and respect for the incredible effort that very, very poor people put into the effort to maintaining a core of dignity in their lives. It doesn't fit into international human rights. Many wouldn't have even heard the word. But it's a consciousness of their importance as agents upon which, it seems to me, human rights has to be built.
Sin duda. Y además, quizá como complemento, también podríamos pensar, ¿no?, en esos vicios por los que le preguntaba en nuestro mundo, ¿no?, también en el mundo de los ricos, y que sí está, ¿no?, bien asentado y tenemos un Estado de Derecho, y sin embargo los vicios cotidianos de los que hablamos no son en absoluto ajenos, ¿no?, quizá como complemento. Quería preguntarle, porque ya que ha mencionado, ¿no?, esa dedicación y ese punto con los derechos humanos, hay una tensión, que yo creo que queda clara en el libro, entre una perspectiva moral universalista de los derechos humanos y una perspectiva moral como la de las virtudes cotidianas, ¿no? Una ética, por un lado, cosmopolita, otros han hablado, ¿no?, de la consideración, que pondría en juego una especie de virtudes excepcionales, precisamente porque nos hace sacar la cabeza de nuestro propio grupo, ¿no? Nos hace pensar en el bien o actuar por el bien de los desconocidos, aunque no formen parte de nuestro grupo cercano, familia, amigos, conocidos. Sin embargo, si lo he entendido, la postura de las virtudes cotidianas lo que defiende es que nuestro sentido de especie es más bien débil, ¿no?, y que la perspectiva moral mayoritaria se centra ahí, en esas virtudes cotidianas, en los humanos concretos a los que les vemos la cara, ¿no? Desde ahí, si la primera pregunta que nos hacemos cuando vemos a una persona ¿es un conciudadano o es un extranjero?, y se entiende que las demandas de los propios, de los ciudadanos, son más importantes desde esta perspectiva que las de los extranjeros, ¿no le parece que ese esquema encaja demasiado bien con el repliegue nacionalista, tanto en lo económico como en lo identitario, que vemos hoy y que en muchas ocasiones tiene tintes claramente xenófobos? ¿Hacia dónde señalaría, si es que cree que hay alguna esperanza por ahí?
I think of human rights universalism as a thought experiment incarnated in international law that asks a simple question, which is, what is the core minimum of things that human beings have to have in order to have any kind of life at all? What are the institutional guarantees, called rights, that they have to have in order to be agents, to have a claim on the state, to have a claim on the mercy of others? What's the basic minimum? I don't think of human rights as the laundry list of every good thing that it would be nice to have. I mean a much more minimal, bare bones universalism of things that I just think any human being in any situation needs to have. And in Gaza, human beings are denied all of those things. So we can look at our television screens every night and see what it's like to be denied everything. Existential security, food, water, clothing, shelter, the law. And to be rightless, stateless, and dispossessed. They're not the only human population that's going through that ordeal, but they're the one we see every day. And we need this thought experiment about what we all need in order to remember that we're all human beings. But what strikes me so much when I teach this stuff is I look out into a classroom of modern international students, and I never see 50 human beings. I see 14 women, 12 men, 2 people are black, 7 people are white, 3 people who may or may not be gay. It's none of my damn business, but they might be. What I see is human difference. And I think difference is primary to the constitution of our identity, not secondary. It's primary. You're a woman, I'm a man, you're of an age, I'm of a different age. All the differences between us are salient. And I think you'd find it a little dull if I regarded you simply as a female example of the human species, right? What matters to you is all the things that make you a specific, one-of-a-kind individual. And I think that's what we all think. So human rights is always battling against the initial plausibility of the particular. It's a thought experiment that says, don't forget the universal, because it's there beneath the particular. But the particular is a driver. And I don't have a difficulty about the fact that Spaniards put Spaniards first. Canadians put Canadians first. There are an enormous number of very problematic things about that. We ignore the suffering of others, or we prioritize the claims of our own and neglect the claims of others. And sometimes this is excruciating. But it seems to me also natural. It seems something we've always done, partly because we have to prioritize. Charles Dickens, you probably know this, had a famous character in his books called Mrs. Jellyby. And Mrs. Jellyby was a woman who always had a far-sighted look in her eye. She was never looking at her children. She was always looking at Africa and the children in Africa. And her own children were neglected because she devoted her whole life to a charity to aid African children. And it's a painful satire. It's an ambiguous satire. I'm not saying Dickens is right, but Dickens is putting his finger on something about moral life, which is that it does make sense for us to prioritize our own first. A person who neglects their own children or their own family is not exercising virtue. They're engaging in some strange form of misunderstanding of the necessary priorities of life. Now, I've gone as far as I can in favor of moral nationalism, but clearly moral nationalism is producing monstrous results. We are watching people drowning in the Mediterranean because we can't muster the resources or the willpower to treat them like human beings. So I don't want to endorse moral nationalism when I call it natural, but it is a fact of moral judgment. And it simply won't do to say Spain shouldn't put Spaniards first, Canada shouldn't put Canadians first, because we always will. I can see you disagree.
Sí. Para eso estamos también en el Festival de las Ideas. Sí, parece muy problemático, aunque entiendo el punto que señala. Creo que efectivamente el hecho, ¿no? Y es parte de lo que creo que tenemos por delante como tarea y está, puede ser quizá un motivo de conversación también, ¿no? ¿Cree que es posible ese movimiento de ampliación de la comunidad moral? O sea, estamos de alguna manera necesariamente o naturalmente, dice usted, incapacitados para esa amplitud que incluya a los otros, por algo tan aleatorio además como el hecho de haber nacido o no dentro de un terreno y más allá vayamos, no solo por el hecho de haber nacido aquí en Europa o hacerlo en el norte de África, sino de hacerlo sin dinero, porque claro, ahí el problema del que estamos hablando es fundamentalmente el de los migrantes pobres, y los 2.400 muertos solo del año pasado en las aguas del Mediterráneo, o el genocidio en Gaza, lo que nos recuerda es que estamos hablando de muchísima gente de la que menos vale, y en parte es porque no pueden saltar y unirse al cosmopolitismo al que sí pueden otros en honor a su riqueza, de manera que me parece problemático en muchos sentidos, pero quizá por ahí...
No. I've spent my whole life exploring this moral boundary. I teach human rights. I'm a passionate believer in international moral concern. But I'm also a believer in international moral responsibility. I think agents, states, nations have a responsibility to take care of their own. It's important that they discharge those responsibilities. When they can't, an international community may well have an obligation to step in and help. But we need to allocate moral responsibility precisely. And sometimes we walk around, and it seems to me an almost imperial reflex, and Europe is has an imperial heritage. We think the whole goddamn world is our responsibility, and that's, I think, a morally suspect reflex. I want democratic societies in Africa to take responsibility for their own children. There are lots of cases when we need international action to stop, for example, the killing in Gaza. It's going to go on indefinitely unless there's intervention. But I've spent a lot of time thinking about intervention, and I know that many of our interventions have been catastrophic mistakes. And many catastrophic mistakes arise from moral universalism and moral certainty. And we have to be careful and prudent about who we decide is our business. And some of this, I also don't want to make excuses. We are the richest societies the world has ever known, and there is a scandal about the degree to which we keep it all to ourselves. I get all that. But international aid and assistance has often not been successful. We've got to be honest about what works and what doesn't, and often it doesn't. I want a moral universalism that is disciplined, clear, knows when to say yes, knows when to say no, and above all stops doing what I call virtue signaling. Blah, 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 that's not backed up by anything other than expressions of sorrow and concern and grief, and doesn't actually change anything at all. That ends up disgracing moral universalism. And so, in a sense, we have to reinvent the terms of our moral relation to other peoples in other countries in a way that we haven't done up to now. And I'm fumbling my way in the dark to see how we would do that in an honest and purposeful way.
Quizá uno de esos términos podría ser, o al menos yo intentaría rescatarlo, pero tomándolo en serio, no como esa palabrería a la que se refería ahora, es ese principio de igualdad moral que aparece también, ¿no?, en las páginas de sus libros. Y el hecho de que, hablando con los habitantes de las favelas en Río y en otros lugares, ¿no?, donde viven vidas de miseria en lo material, pero tienen, ¿no?, esa capacidad de construir comunidades morales y cuidarse pese a estar descuidados, no solo por sus naciones, sino también por el resto. ¿Cuál es el punto de defender, como hace Europa, que usted cree que este es el momento, ¿no?, para Europa, un principio como el de la igualdad moral? ¿Qué significa si no nos tomamos en serio que, aunque hayan nacido en el otro lugar del Mediterráneo, por ejemplo, sus derechos, sus intereses, sus proyectos de vida valen igual que los nuestros? Si esto nos lo tomamos en serio, yo creo que también es muy difícil que sea creíble algo de lo que decimos y construir, ¿no?, una Europa para quiénes y desde dónde, desde qué principios, que no queden vacíos. ¿Dónde está esa credibilidad para construir un proyecto que ahora se sienta capaz, que no pues vaya, ¿no?, haciendo seguidismo, y en el que, para mí, pues sí, la postura más de los pequeños estados, o grandes algunos de ellos, no tenga tanta cabida? ¿Qué Europa? ¿Cómo la piensa?
The problem is that we have moral equality that's just blah, blah, blah. Because, in fact, we say we will give you asylum, for example, and, in fact, we deny asylum to most. We say we want to, I mean, what I'm looking for is some moral realism here. We need immigration policies. I'm the son and grandson of political refugees. Do I like immigration? You bet I do. Because my whole family had a new start in Canada because of it. But moral realism means saying, having a legal stream of migration that is disciplined, clear, but has its limits. It has an upward limit. You can say every person in the world is a moral equal, fine, but it doesn't give you an immigration policy. That's my problem. You have to have a realistic policy that says Spain can take in so many people. Tough. This is our calculation of what we need to build Spain and make it grow. This is the number of people we feel that we can turn from strangers into friends, from strangers into Spaniards. And if you come here illegally, we're going to send you back. We're going to send you back because we can't have a society in which the rules we make are always broken. And so you want to have a society that is multicultural, that is welcoming to newcomers, but says, we're not a hotel, we're not a bus station, we're a national community, and we want you to join it. But here is how we work. And I think that's compatible with moral universalism, but it's not compatible with open borders. And our failure to be honest about this is creating a kind of, is giving our moral universalism nothing but a bad reputation. Because the gap between what we say we believe and what we actually do at our borders has become a moral scandal. And that's what I want to eliminate. It'd be nice to have a Europe which says what it's going to do, does it, and enforces its law. And I want to distinguish between what I'm saying and the far right across Europe. I want more migration, not less, but I want lawful migration followed by integration into the national community and a welcome. And Europe has done a much better job about this than it often admits, and the far right is telling us it's a failure. It's not. It's actually been pretty good, and it's pretty good in Canada. But it's the discrepancy between moral principle and moral action that's bothering me. That's what I'm trying to focus on.
Gracias. Conectando con esto y avanzando, una de las preguntas que quería hacerle era por el peso que le concede a los factores económicos a la hora de, frente a las identidades culturales o nacionales, precisamente, ¿no? Se ha referido mucho en sus libros a las distintas comunidades locales que comparten un idioma, que comparten un credo, una religión, una tradición, y ha hablado también de cómo se integran en ciudades cosmopolitas donde hay, señala muy bien, ¿no?, coexistencia, pero no necesariamente convivencia. ¿Le parece que la clase o la condición socioeconómica supone un elemento igualador, un rasgo identitario que hace que las posibilidades reales y las preocupaciones de la gente se parezcan independientemente o por encima de esas otras pertenencias que tienen una fe o una etnia? Y en relación con esto, quería preguntarle, bueno, pues, ¿qué les diría a quienes practican en su vida esas virtudes cotidianas? Son razonablemente generosos, son dignos de confianza, son atentos con quienes están a su alrededor y, sin embargo, ven su libertad tremendamente limitada por motivos económicos, ¿no? Perdón, porque es que no sé cuánto se oye esto. ¿Me oye, profesor? Sí. ¿Ahora sí? En relación con esto, decía, ¿cuánto, ¿no? ¿Qué podemos decir a quienes practican esas virtudes cotidianas y tienen esa claridad y, sin embargo, ven su libertad pues, muy limitada por motivos económicos? Los dos elementos, si puede decir algo sobre ellos y luego añado las otras.
When I went to Los Angeles, one of the chapters of the book is about Los Angeles, I was enormously struck by, again, the contrast between the claim that Los Angeles makes, particularly in the white middle class, that we're a multicultural, we're all in this together, and the extreme geographic segmentation and class segmentation of Los Angeles into white middle-class neighborhoods, black middle-class neighborhoods, Hispanic neighborhoods. So again, there's a kind of gulf between what we think we are, an open, accessible, multicultural society, and the reality of our effectively residential segregation. And the residential segregation, as you imply, is built upon economic disadvantage. And so, I'm a liberal. I actually like capitalism. I like capitalist society. And I'm profoundly committed to moral and legal equality in our society. And I'm always struck by the gulf between what we say we are and what we actually are, and how little interaction there is between, in Europe, Christian and Muslim communities, between black and white communities. There's a tremendous amount of segmentation and fragmentation, some of which is innocent, some of which is just fine. People should live where they want to live. But it produces a gap between what we think we are and what we are, and it'd be good to close that a little so we stop telling each other moral fairy tales. That's the kind of what I'm concerned about.
Y por otro lado, lo que podemos ver, también por pensarlo, lo decía antes, ¿no? Está bien que demos ejemplos. Y pensaba ahora, escuchándole, cuando viajamos en el metro de Madrid, por ejemplo, o en el caso de Estados Unidos, ¿no? Vamos en Greyhound, en la compañía de autobuses, la coincidencia que hay ahí efectivamente entre los usuarios en algunos de estos lugares, ¿no? de distintas formas de transporte público, efectivamente, hay una confluencia de personas que creen en dioses distintos, que practican, que van vestidos de maneras distintas, cuyas vidas, si empezamos la mañana a las 6:30, 7 de la mañana, en el Pozo, en la zona de Entrevías, y nos desplazamos al centro de Madrid o incluso al norte de Madrid para hacer trabajos precarios, esa hora y media de desplazamiento, hay en muchas de esas vidas, pese a que sean migrantes que vienen de Colombia o del norte de África y tengan sus respectivas credos y concepciones del bien, hay muchos otros elementos que son compartidos y también esas limitaciones. Creo que hay algo en ese perfil también socioeconómico que les iguala, que nos iguala mucho más, ¿no? Y que quizá también es un elemento al que apelar, ¿no? Comunitario, para saltar o mirar a veces más allá del propio grupo, ¿no? De los propios iguales. En un momento de su libro dice que una de las cosas, en las conclusiones, ¿no? Que una de las cosas que encontraron con más claridad era el deseo de orden, al que antes se refería, el deseo de un orden moral en el sentido de que hubiese algo que permitiese un marco de expectativas, ¿no? Por así decir, que permitiese a los ciudadanos en cualquier parte del mundo pensar que su vida tiene sentido. ¿Qué les diría en ese caso a quienes lo que ven cuando miran a su alrededor es más bien un mundo movido por fuerzas impersonales y a veces incomprensibles, como el mercado, por ejemplo, o personales, ¿no? Los privilegios heredados, la corrupción, que son elementos, ambos, que afectan profundamente a su vida, pero sobre los que no tienen ninguna capacidad de control.
Well, that is. Look, we all feel. I'm a prosperous middle-class person with as many life chances as you could possibly have. I've had a lucky life. I think you've had a lucky life, thanks to a lot of effort on your part. But we all feel buffeted and at the mercy of forces larger. We're in the middle of a right-wing counter-revolution that is sweeping away the order that I grew up in as a young person. In other words, the historical narrative of moral progress, of steadily increased inclusion, steadily greater moral equality that I have lived by, is now in peril, is now in danger. The big narrative that made sense of my life is crumbling. Well, it crumbled for my parents' generation. They grew up in the 20s and suddenly found themselves facing Mussolini, Hitler, and Franco, right? Their world was pulverized. So we have to accept the struggle to create meaning for our lives when meta-narratives, historical narratives, begin to collapse. And that's where the ordinary virtues come in. I mean, if you look at our lives, we're ceaselessly trying to create forms of order that make our life bearable and give sense to our life. You're raising 2 children, you tell me, that's the center of your life. Doing it well is incredibly important to you, as it should be. You want to be a good mother because you want to have 2 good daughters. This is a life project. It gives meaning to your life. Your life might not have the same meaning if you didn't have that urgent purpose. I have children in the same way. The drama is that what makes sense begins to shrink. It shrinks down to our families, to our personal relations, and sometimes it becomes like a parody of the stories I began talking to you about, which is you're sweeping a tiny piece of cardboard to keep it clean because the meaning-giving aspects of your life has shrunk to a tiny, terrifying place. And I think many of us are in that situation at the moment. The big narratives are in enormous trouble. And so we reach back to give meaning through the exercise of the ordinary virtues in our ordinary life, but that leaves a gap. We need the big story, we need the big narrative, and we need hope. We need a sense that Europe is not going to collapse. We need a sense that Spain will continue as a national project. We need a sense that the United States will not swallow up my country, and on we go. And I do want to emphasize that. Our lives depend on making sense of the big story as well as the little. And if you only have the little story, it doesn't compensate for the collapse of sense with the big story.
Creo que en ese camino, que en esa pérdida, ¿no?, de espacio, esa reclusión de la vida que podemos entender, más o menos controlar o manejar o intentar cuidar, hay algo también que revisar en la idea, ¿no?, fuerte del individualismo, que nos llevaría quizá demasiado lejos, ¿no? Pero que hay algo ahí que recuperar posiblemente en espacios comunitarios o espacios compartidos también con otros, ¿no?, que también pueden impulsarse desde las instituciones, pero este también quizá podría ser uno de ellos. Ha mencionado también el franquismo en un momento dado, y la verdad es que al pensar en lugares con heridas abiertas como España, donde todavía hoy pues hay más de 4.000 fosas comunes llenas de víctimas del franquismo sin identificar, donde los desaparecidos ascienden a más de 114.000, ¿qué elementos cree que deben darse para poder hablar de reconciliación y perdón, como los que usted describe? Aquí, más bien, el movimiento memorialista ha hablado siempre de verdad, justicia y reparación. Hay que recordar que Franco murió matando a través del garrote vil en 1974, con fusilamiento, pelotones de fusilamiento en septiembre del año 75. Como historiador, ¿qué consecuencias cree que tiene para una democracia joven el hecho de no haber afrontado los horrores, ¿no?, de la dictadura militar? O, por decirlo sintéticamente, ¿cómo podemos hablar de reconciliación y de perdón cuando no se ha permitido hablar siquiera de memoria?
Well, this is obviously striking at an important chord, particularly this idea of suppressed memory, the sense that things cannot be said. And a society can't be at peace and can't be healthy if there's silences. But equally, it's very important not to weaponize memory in the pursuit of power, in the pursuit of vengeance. The goal here is to have truth, painful truth. I remember going to South Africa and watching communities go through the truth and reconciliation process where horrible facts were disclosed about police brutality towards the black community. And the black community, sitting 800 in a hall, would literally moan together in a kind of collective moan as they relived some of this experience. And every society has to go through it, and Spain has to go through it. What concerns me is then using this painful past to settle cheap political scores in the present, denounce this person as fascist, that person as fascist, and not have a politics that says, let's have the truth, and then let's stop tormenting each other. What worries me so much is we forget the collective enterprise here is to come out of it being able to live with each other. Live with people who have different paths, with different memories. Sometimes to live with people who are the descendants of perpetrators, the descendants of people who've done terrible harm to themselves and to others. And it takes a long time. You said it's 50 years and there are still things that have not been said about Franco. But that's, I think, because we have some childlike view that history has endings, and history doesn't end. Franco is still in the house, you know, and that's why this wakens such a strong chord. But what is the objective here? The objective can't be to settle scores. The objective cannot be to define political groups as criminal descendants of the Frankist regime. It's to clear the house, to get us so we can sit in the same room and talk to each other. And I watched it happen in South Africa, and it was convulsively painful. But the establishment of the facts, the factual record, made it possible for those who used to defend the apartheid regime to realize it was indefensible. And that's an enormous victory, to discover that something is indefensible. Germany took 50, 60, 70 years to admit that certain things were indefensible. And now it's built a culture of not forgetting, but a culture of truth, which it seems to me to be an enormous achievement in Europe. And I hope Spain can find the courage and persistence to establish a culture of truth in this society. And lest you think I'm giving you lessons because Canada's bloody perfect, we're struggling with the same issue with our Aboriginal peoples. They have a different history than mine. It's very painful to listen to an Aboriginal Canadian tell me the national story. I don't want to hear it. I want them to say, why don't you acknowledge our story? This is what it's about. Getting mutual acknowledgement of pain, mutual acknowledgement of incompatible stories, with a purpose to creating a future together, instead of being locked in the prison of the past forever. That seems to me the thing you want to avoid. Condemning a society to be locked in a past that it can't escape. So.
Gracias. Por ahí hay también, ¿no? Mucho por lo que tendríamos que seguir, podríamos seguir charlando, pero vamos a ir terminando, de manera que quiero preguntarle finalmente en relación a otro de los libros precisamente, ¿no? el de En busca de consuelo, se titula en castellano, y ahí explora distintas, ¿no? Maneras de qué es esto de ser consolado y hallar consuelo, y recorre doctrinas de la consolación desde la hebrea, la cristiana, la estoica, incluso la del progreso. Querría preguntarle por qué afirma en un momento que el consuelo es lo opuesto a la resignación. Precisamente, yo diría que hay quienes se alejan de esta idea de consuelo o de la esperanza, que usted dice que es constitutiva, ¿no?, del consuelo, precisamente porque podría llamar al conformismo, a asumir las cosas tal y como son, tratar de vivir lo mejor posible ahí, ¿no?, en un mundo atravesado con una crisis ecológica y social, en un mundo desigual y en guerras. Alguien diría que resignarse y aceptar el statu quo es algo que no nos podemos permitir. ¿Por qué el consuelo del que habla no va por ahí? ¿O es posible acabar con un mensaje de esperanza que no se engañe sobre la realidad?
Right. Well, this is a vast subject, and we're coming close to the end of time, and I must promise not to talk for 20 minutes in answer to this question. I wrote a book about consolation because I've known failure in my life. I've known loss in my life. I've known the death of people I loved. Standard things. No particular tragedies. I've had a very happy and good life. But I have known moments of deep sorrow. And I've had to recover from moments of deep sorrow. Sorrow so deep I felt I was crazy, And this is a part of the human experience. And there is, I began to look at consolation because it's a religious word. I'm not a religious person. But our traditions have an immense reservoir of wisdom and learning about how to deal with loss, failure, and sorrow. And so I wanted to recover that because secularism has been a gain. We've been freed from often religious superstition, but there's been loss in the sense that we've lost some of the deep wisdom of religious tradition. So I wanted to bring some of those things back. That was what the project was. I don't associate consolation with resignation. I think of it differently. When my father died, when my brother died, when I sustained losses, I was inconsolable because I loved them. I mean, it's not complicated. I loved them, and I lost them, you know? And I think many of us have been through this experience of wandering in the dark woods for a long period when we lose somebody who matters to us. I'm not resigned to the death of my father or the death of my brother. That doesn't begin to describe it. What I feel now is enormous gratitude that they lived, that I was lucky enough to know them, that I was lucky enough to have the father that I had, that I managed to be reconciled with my brother before he died. And that's an attempt to give me reasons to go on living. It's about how you rekindle hope after loss. I mean, I understand exactly where you come from because the Western political tradition is a revolt against religious endurance of suffering. This is a great thing about the Western tradition. From the French Revolution onwards, people saying, don't tell me to be silent and still and suffer injustice and poverty. I want to change it. And Western politics is animated by that conviction above all. But the reality about politics, and I've done some, is politics is often a story of failure. It's a story of trying to do something for the people and it not working or it having unintended consequences. And any decent politics has to deal with the failure of politics. And if it has to deal with the failure of politics, then it has to think about how do you console yourself when your dreams don't meet reality. And so that's the political dimension of consolation that I wanted to talk. Not so that we then sit back and say, give up, but so we get back on our feet and try again.
Me ha gustado especialmente, y cerramos ya, me ha gustado especialmente de todas las formas, ¿no?, en las que recupera las maneras de consolación en la filosofía, la propia escritura, la música como maneras de consolación. Me ha gustado esa que toma a partir de Hume y que vincula a los otros precisamente, ¿no?, a la compañía y los otros como el mejor consuelo. Profesor Ignatieff, nos hemos quedado sin tiempo como imaginábamos. Ha sido un verdadero placer conversar esta noche con usted, dejando claro, como hace el espíritu del Festival de las Ideas, que no es necesario estar de acuerdo para mantener un diálogo amistoso en plena calle. Muchas gracias de nuevo a todos los asistentes y buenas noches. Gracias.